Slender Man did not emerge from the forest or from some ancient tome. He was born on the internet, a creation of pixels, imagination, and collective fear. Yet when we examine his form, his posture, and the way he interacts with those who believe, it becomes clear that he echoes symbols far older than the digital age. Throughout human history, countless cultures have imagined beings that are impossibly tall, faceless, and observing from the shadows, entities that demand attention, obedience, or respect, without ever speaking. From the faceless Nyx of ancient Greece to shadowy figures in European forest folklore, from jinn that test human will to legends of black-coated figures who haunt children, Slender Man is not entirely new. He is the modern incarnation of timeless fears. His limbs are unnaturally long, his presence impossible to ignore, and his faceless visage allows any observer to project their deepest anxieties upon him. In this sense, he functions much like the archetypal figures of cult and religious mythology, an entity whose power is not measured by what he does, but by what believers perceive him to do. He does not strike immediately. He waits, he watches, he cultivates a sense of inevitability. This quiet manipulation mirrors the structure of cultic belief systems, in which obedience, fear, and faith are intertwined, and where the unseen authority holds sway over thought and behavior. In the forests, in schools, and in the shadows of the online world, people have reported encounters that feel profoundly real, even if they cannot be verified. Glimpses of a tall, thin figure standing unnaturally straight at the edge of the trees. Dreams in which faceless forms guide or watch. Photographs where something seems out of place, captured only after the fact. These stories, though unconfirmed, carry the same emotional weight as centuries-old myths. They reflect the same psychological mechanisms: fear of the unknown, projection of anxiety, and the need for narrative to explain the unexplainable. As we explore the legend of Slender Man, it is crucial to understand that his true power lies not in existence, but in belief. Across centuries, humans have created symbols to contain the inexplicable and to navigate the shadows of uncertainty. Slender Man, in all his digital and cultural forms, is simply the latest expression of this age-old impulse. A reminder that what terrifies us is often less the figure itself, and more the part of ourselves that responds to it. Slender Man first appeared publicly in 2009, not through whispers in the woods, but on a quiet internet forum dedicated to image manipulation. What began as a creative exercise quickly took on a life of its own. A pair of altered photographs showed children playing in the distance, while in the background stood a tall, faceless figure, elongated and unnaturally still. The captions were subtle, vague, and unsettling, suggesting disappearances, memory loss, and something watching from just beyond the frame. There was no direct threat, no explanation, only implication. Within days, others began adding to the idea. New images appeared, short stories followed. Each contribution respected an unspoken rule: never explain too much. Slender Man was not a monster that attacked openly. He observed, influenced, and waited. Is precisely what allowed the myth to spread. Like older religious or cult figures, his identity remained flexible, shaped by those who believed in him rather than defined by a single doctrine. As the legend grew, certain patterns emerged. Slender Man was often associated with forests, abandoned buildings, and schools, places of transition, vulnerability, and silence. Witnesses described electronic interference, headaches, nausea, and a sense of being watched. These details mirrored reports found in historical accounts of supposed divine or demonic encounters, where physical symptoms accompanied belief. Whether coincidence or unconscious imitation, the similarities were difficult to ignore. More importantly, the internet allowed Slender Man to function like a decentralized belief system. There was no leader, no official scripture, yet the rules were understood intuitively. Do not look too long. Do not follow him. Do not invite attention. The myth punished curiosity, much like ancient warnings against forbidden knowledge. Over time, this shared understanding blurred the boundary between fiction and experience. People did not simply read about Slender Man, they participated in his world. By the early 2010s, reports began to surface of individuals claiming to have seen something resembling Slender Man outside of the screen. Tall silhouettes at the edge of forests, figures standing too still to be human, shadows that disappeared the moment they were noticed. These accounts were inconsistent, unverified, and often dismissed, yet they followed a strangely similar emotional pattern: confusion first, fear second, and doubt only afterward. For those who experienced them, the encounters felt real enough to linger. Slender Man had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a story told online. He had become a shared symbol, sustained by collective imagination, cultural memory, and belief. And like many figures before him, gods, spirits, watchers. Once enough people believed they were being observed, the feeling itself became difficult to escape. As Slender Man spread across forums, blogs, and early video platforms, a shift quietly began to take place. The stories were no longer limited to fiction written for entertainment. Some accounts were presented differently. Less polished, more uncertain, often framed as personal experiences rather than narratives. These individuals were not claiming to encounter a monster. Instead, they described moments that felt wrong, incomplete, or difficult to explain. One recurring detail appeared across multiple reports: distance. Slender Man was rarely seen up close. Witnesses described a tall figure standing far away, at the edge of a tree line, behind a school fence, or partially obscured by fog. The figure did not move toward them. It simply stood there. In several cases, the observer only noticed the figure after feeling watched, as if awareness came before sight. Another consistent element was hesitation. People described questioning what they were seeing in real time. Probably a tree, maybe a person, just a shadow. Many reported looking away briefly, only to find the figure gone when they looked back. This uncertainty became part of the experience itself. There was no clear moment of confirmation, only the lingering sense that something had been present. Physical reactions were also frequently mentioned. Headaches, pressure behind the eyes, nausea, and sudden anxiety appeared in multiple accounts. Importantly, these symptoms were often described before the figure was noticed, not after. Some witnesses reported electronic disturbances, phones losing signal, cameras failing to focus, audio cutting out, though no recordings were ever clear enough to function as proof. The absence of evidence became as notable as the claims themselves. Several reports involved children or adolescents, particularly in wooded areas or near schools. In these cases, adults often dismissed the sightings as imagination or misinterpretation. However, the descriptions shared striking similarities across different locations and cultures, even when the witnesses had no known connection to Slender Man media. Tall, thin, faceless. Still. Always watching, never approaching. Psychologists later noted that these experiences followed a recognizable pattern seen in other belief-driven phenomena. The encounter was brief, the emotional impact was strong. Rational explanation came later, if at all. For many, the memory remained vivid despite uncertainty about what had actually occurred. The experience mattered more than the explanation. What made these accounts unsettling was not their credibility, but their consistency. Individually, each story could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed a pattern, not of proof, but of perception. Slender Man functioned less like a physical being, and more like a presence people felt they had narrowly avoided understanding. By this stage, the myth had fully detached from its origin. People were no longer asking who created Slender Man. They were asking whether noticing him was a mistake. And once that question takes root, the idea of being watched becomes difficult to unthink. For years, Slender Man existed in a strange, protected space. He was unsettling, but distant. A figure that lived inside screens, stories, and imagination. Even when people claimed to see him, the world had an easy response. Misperception, suggestion, coincidence. There was no urgency to look deeper. That changed when an incident occurred that could not be dismissed as a story. It did not begin with fear, panic, or chaos. It began quietly, with ordinary routines. School, friendships, a sleepover. No dark rituals. No dramatic warning signs from the outside. Nothing about the situation appeared unusual. That normality would later become one of the most disturbing aspects. When authorities became involved, the initial assumption was simple: a violent act between young people. Motive unclear, details confusing. But as investigators listened more closely, a specific explanation kept surfacing. Not once, but repeatedly, calmly, consistently. Unnamed. The explanation did not involve anger or personal conflict. It involved obligation. A belief that something was required. That failure to act would bring consequences. Not symbolic ones, but physical harm to family members. The reasoning was not emotional. It was procedural, almost logical, as if following instructions that had already been accepted as true. This was the moment Slender Man crossed a line. For the first time, The name appeared not on forums or creepypasta archives, but in police interviews, court documents, and medical evaluations. The narrative was no longer controlled by anonymous writers or online communities. It was now filtered through professionals trained to separate fantasy from reality, and they were forced to confront a problem they did not have language for. Media coverage followed quickly, but unevenly. Early reports avoided specifics, referring only to an online myth or fictional character. As more details emerged, the discomfort grew. This was not a case of someone pretending a monster was real. It was a case of belief-shaping decision-making in a measurable, catastrophic way. Experts debated how it could happen. Some blamed exposure to horror content. Others pointed to developmental psychology, shared delusions, or vulnerability amplified by isolation and online reinforcement. None of these explanations fully satisfied the public, because they addressed mechanisms, not meaning. The question people kept asking was simpler and more dangerous. How could something openly fictional become real enough to act upon? From that point forward, Slender Man could no longer be treated as harmless. Schools issued warnings, parents monitored content, platforms reassessed responsibility. The myth had triggered a response from institutions that usually ignore internet folklore. And yet, even as the case moved through the legal system, something uncomfortable remained. The belief did not dissolve when confronted with consequences. It persisted, adapted, and retreated back into quieter spaces online. Less visible, but more cautious. The incident forced the world to pay attention, but it did not resolve the question at the center of the myth. It only proved one thing beyond doubt. Slender Man did not need to exist physically to cause real harm. He only needed to be believed, by the right people, at the wrong time. In the next part, the location, the details, and the full weight of that case will be examined, not to sensationalize it, but to understand why this incident became the point of no return. The incident took place in 2014, in a quiet suburban town in Wisconsin, a community known more for schools and parks than crime. Nothing about the location suggested it would become internationally associated with one of the most disturbing cases linked to an online myth. 3 girls were involved, all 12 years old. They were classmates, friends, by all outward appearances, ordinary children navigating school life, social pressure, and imagination in the digital age. There were no prior records of violence, no known history of abuse, no warning signs that would normally trigger intervention. The plan, according to later investigations, was not spontaneous. It developed over time, through conversations, shared stories, and private reinforcement. The objective was framed as a necessity, not an act of anger or hatred, but a task that had to be completed to prevent something worse from happening. On the day of the incident, the girls met under normal circumstances. There was no confrontation, no argument. When the attack occurred, it was sudden and sustained. Afterwards, the victim was left alone, severely injured. She survived. Her survival would later become one of the most critical facts of the case, not just legally, but psychologically. It provided a direct account that contradicted any attempt to reframe the event as misunderstanding or exaggeration. When authorities apprehended the 2 attackers, there was no attempt to hide what they had done. Interviews revealed explanations that were consistent with each other and delivered without visible panic. The reasoning presented was structured, not chaotic. They stated they believed Slender Man was real. They believed he demanded proof of loyalty. They believed failure to comply would result in harm to their families. This belief was not expressed metaphorically, it was literal. Investigators initially treated the references as fantasy language layered onto a violent act. That assumption did not hold. Psychological evaluations found that the belief system was internally coherent within the girls. Not roleplay. Not storytelling after the fact. The legal system faced an immediate problem. The suspects were minors. The crime was severe. The motive involved a fictional entity. But the consequences were real. Prosecutors had to determine whether the case should be handled through juvenile rehabilitation, adult criminal court, or long-term psychiatric care. Medical professionals diagnosed severe mental illness in both attackers, though not identically. The court proceedings stretched over years, involving evaluations, appeals, and public scrutiny. Ultimately, both were committed to mental health institutions rather than traditional prisons. The case forced multiple institutions to confront gaps they were not prepared for. Law enforcement had no framework for crimes motivated by internet-born belief systems. Schools lacked tools to detect shared delusional reinforcement. Parents underestimated the persistence of online myth immersion. Platforms distanced themselves, citing fiction disclaimers that proved irrelevant in practice. Importantly, no evidence ever emerged that Slender Man commanded the act in any direct way. There were no messages, no secret instructions, no hidden community directing behavior. The influence was indirect, but cumulative, a belief loop that closed in on itself. The Wisconsin case was not about a monster. It was about how belief can harden into obligation when left unchallenged, especially in developing minds. From this point on, Slender Man was no longer treated as a harmless horror character. He became a case study cited in psychology, media ethics, and digital culture research. Not because he existed, but because people acted as if he did. In the next part, we will examine why this particular myth had the structure to produce that outcome, while thousands of others did not. The shape that humans already knew. Ancient echoes, no conclusions, asterisk. Before discussing belief, influence, or responsibility, there is one question that cannot be avoided. Why did Slender Man, among thousands of fictional creations, settle so easily into belief? Why did he feel familiar, even to people encountering him for the first time? The answer may not lie in the internet at all. Appearance. Non-human, faceless, elongated. This form is not new. Across cultures and centuries, human societies have repeatedly produced figures with the same core traits. Not monstrous in detail, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, too smooth, too empty where a face should be. In ancient belief systems, beings without faces were often associated with forces beyond human negotiation. Not personalities, but principles. Hunger, night, death, attorneys. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean world, chthonic entities, beings tied to the underworld, were rarely described with clear facial features. Identity was not their function, presence was. In Greek tradition, Nyx, the embodiment of night, was not commonly depicted with expression or form. She was a condition, a boundary. Something that arrived, rather than appeared. In Middle Eastern folklore, certain classifications of jinn were described as formless, or without stable appearance, not because they lacked shape, but because their shape was not meant to be understood or fixed. A face invites empathy. A face allows negotiation. Facelessness removes both. In medieval European folklore, especially in rural regions, tall shadowed figures appear repeatedly, not as demons in the Christian sense, but as forest-bound entities. Black Annis, recorded in England, was often described as tall, dark, thin-limbed, and associated with wooded areas. She was said to seize children who wandered too far. Importantly, she was not portrayed as chaotic or impulsive. She acted according to rules. Many such figures were not moral judges. They were enforcers of boundaries, of where one should not go, and what one should not know. The German forest figure, der Grossmann. Long before the internet, German folklore recorded stories of der Grossmann, literally, the tall man. Descriptions varied, but certain traits remained consistent. Unnaturally tall. Appearing at the edge of forests, rarely speaking. Observed at a distance. Associated with disorientation or disappearance. These accounts were never unified into a single doctrine. They did not form a religion. They existed as fragments. Local warnings, half-stories. Things not fully explained. Which is precisely why they persisted. No scripture. No authority. No final version. The cult structure without a cult. Here is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Slender Man does not behave like a modern fictional villain. He behaves like a pre-religious figure. No origin story that matters. No clear rules, only implied consequences. No central text, only variations. No visible face. No voice, only assumptions about what he wants. This mirrors early belief systems that functioned before organized religion, before doctrine. Before priests, belief was maintained through suggestion, fear, and shared reinforcement, not instruction. Crucially, such figures do not demand worship. They demand compliance. You do not pray to them. You avoid angering them. Why this matters, and why it's dangerous. None of this proves continuity, but it does suggest something more unsettling. When a modern fictional figure accidentally aligns with an ancient psychological template, it bypasses skepticism. It doesn't feel new. it feels remembered. For adults, this familiarity remains symbolic. For developing minds, it can become literal. The Wisconsin case did not emerge from belief in fiction alone. It emerged from belief shaped into obligation, using a structure humanity has responded to for thousands of years. In the next part, we will examine how this structure behaves once it enters the internet age, and why modern platforms amplify it instead of dissolving it. From myth to obligation, when belief becomes action, a cult perspective. At some point, a story stops being a story, not because it is proven, but because belief quietly changes into obligation. Slender Man never issued commands. There are no recorded messages telling anyone what to do. No scripture. No ritual instructions. No appearance demanding worship. And yet, people acted. This is where the phenomenon becomes disturbing, not as fiction, but as structure. Across history, the most dangerous belief systems were never the loudest ones. They did not announce themselves as religions. Instead, they existed as silent pressures, unspoken expectations that formed naturally in the minds of those who encountered them. In ancient traditions, this was known as the presence that does not ask, but is still obeyed. Slender Man functions the same way. Those who believed in him did not describe being told what to do. Instead, they described a feeling and understanding that something was required, that if nothing was done, something worse would happen. That attention alone was not enough. That acknowledgement demanded action. This pattern is not new. In pre-modern cult systems, especially those involving forest entities, unnamed gods, or chthonic beings, belief was never passive. To know of a presence was already to be involved. Once seen, once acknowledged, one was no longer neutral. The obligation was not written. It was felt, one that believers feel compelled to fill on their own. And when humans are left to define what an unseen entity might want, history shows that the results are rarely benign. The Wisconsin incident did not emerge from chaos or sudden madness. According to statements, those involved believed they were fulfilling a requirement, that their actions were part of a larger logic, one they did not invent, but discovered. A logic that suggested recognition would come only after sacrifice, obedience, or proof of loyalty. This mirrors initiation logic found in closed belief systems and fringe cult structures, where devotion escalates not through instruction, but through internalization. The individual begins to anticipate the will of the entity, even in its silence. What makes this especially unsettling is that Slender Man does not promise rewards. There is no salvation, no protection, no clear outcome. Only the sense that something is watching, something is aware, and something expects consistency. In occult traditions, this is considered the most dangerous stage of belief. Not worship, but alignment. When behavior adjusts itself around an unseen presence. When fear turns into duty. And when imagination no longer feels optional. Whether Slender Man exists is ultimately irrelevant. Because once belief becomes operational, once it alters decisions, overrides hesitation, and justifies action, the entity no longer needs to appear. It has already crossed over. Before this ends, there's one thing worth remembering. Slender Man didn't spread because people believed in him. He spread because people made space for him. Most myths fade when exposed to light. Some disappear when explained. But others survive precisely because they never fully reveal themselves. They exist in the gaps between fear and curiosity. If you've watched this far, you've already done what every witness does. And that has always been enough. So before you click away, ask yourself one question. Not out loud, not here in the comments, just privately. If a presence never asks for belief, but still feels acknowledged, at what point does observation turn into participation? Good night.